In our Romans passage today, we have what can be considered to be a very Calvinistic theology on sin. Paul is saying that whenever he wants to do good, or even though he knows the law, that the reality is that sin creeps in and that he continually and perpetually sins. And that often, even when he thinks he's not sinning, he finds out that maybe he did something for the wrong reason. And that ultimately in this passage, we get the understanding that Paul believes that his loyalty is more to sin than to God. And so I thought we would kind of talk about that today in our sermon time. Where do we keep our loyalty? It is very hard to put our loyalty always in God. So hard that many of our theological forefathers, not just Paul and not just Calvin, but St. Augustine and many more, have said that basically we are all sinners because we cannot put our loyalty in God, right? So where do we put our loyalty? And how do we act each and every day? I thought loyalty would be a really good conversation piece to have as this is the 4th of July weekend, and as we remember the story of the founding of our nation and those who no longer wanted to show their loyalty to the throne in England. So where do we put our loyalty? Juggling where we put our loyalty can be hard, and lines often become blurred. One of our Bible passages tells us that wherever we put our money is where we put our loyalty, right? So if we are putting our money into consumerism, then that's where our loyalty is. If we're putting our money into charity, that's where our loyalty is. If we're storing all of our money, that's where our loyalty is. But I think what has happened in our country especially is that instead of putting our loyalty into anything, we're really becoming loyal only to ourselves. And I think that it speaks to what Paul's message is in Romans today. That we cannot trust ourselves to be making these decisions over loyalty. And that when we put loyalty in ourselves, when we put that trust in ourselves, we make decisions that are ultimately bad. We have a problem in America right now. Nobody is listening to anybody. We are divided. Everybody's feelings are being hurt. And nobody is feeling heard. But some of these problems come from the reality that for far too long, instead of really putting our loyalty into a nation or really putting our loyalty into God, we have been putting loyalty into ourselves. We have been saying, I know best. I have experienced X, therefore I know best. My husband's grandfather was a wonderful man, but he was not an easy person to have a conversation with, because he had traveled the world in his day, and he had seen all of the countries in his day, and he knew everything about those countries that you needed to know. And he knew everything about a lot of things. But the interesting thing about him is that even if it had been 25 years since his last visit to a place, or even if it had been 15 years since his last exposure to an experience, as soon as you said to him, this is what I did, he shut you down and told you all about his experience. Even if you said to him, well, that's no longer there, he couldn't take it out of his mind that it was the way that he remembered it. And so it was never really a conversation with him. It was mostly just listening to his stories. He had other wonderful qualities, but that was not one of them. But he represents, I think, in a little bit more extreme way, how we all have become. Well, I have experienced something one way, and so now that's the only way I see that event, that happening, right? And instead of opening ourselves up for conversation and for conflict, as soon as conflict happens, we shut ourselves down. And as soon as conflict happens in a church, a new church is created and the church is split. As soon as conflict happens in a church, people who used to eat together happily sit on separate sides of the sanctuary. Why? Why can we not have a society that understands that conflict and conversation is healthy? Why can't we have churches that understand that a little bit of argument doesn't mean that you don't love each other? I'll tell you why. Because instead of putting our loyalty outside of ourselves and to our greater God, we have put our loyalty into ourselves, into those who are like us, and into our own trusting of our own experiences. The loyalty to what we know has become so ingrained that we are no longer even loyal to our nation. This is the 4th of July weekend where we celebrate what it means to be an American. We celebrate all of those who fought in the Revolutionary War to gain our independence from England. And we remember all the subsequent military veterans and those who died in war, who served our country to continue the independence that we have, the freedom that we have. The freedom to choose, right? But instead of putting our loyalty into a nation, into America, we have broken down what that means by putting our loyalty into ourselves and into our own experience of America. Whatever that experience is, right? If you live rural, if you live in the city, if you live in the south, if you live in the north, if you live in the east, if you live in the west, we've all become accustomed to our America, our story, what it looks like, what it feels like for us, and we can't fathom what it is for other people. This past week, I ended up talking about cows with somebody, and it brought back the very vivid memory that we used to live down the street from a cow farm, and every once in a while cows would get out of their pens, and I would be driving 55 miles an hour on a country road and have to come to a screeching halt because there were cows in the middle of the road. The person I was speaking to lived in New York City their entire life and could not fathom seeing cows outside of maybe a fair or two, let alone these giant cows in the middle of a road. Our experiences of America are very different. Very different. And yet, that is both America. America is a nation that is different. We are a nation that is so large compared to even Europe, right? And yet, we constantly think that we have to treat ourselves and all of America as the same. We can't do everything just like Europe because the scale is so much larger in America. Instead of our allegiance being to ourselves and to our own experiences, our loyalty needs to be in the greater good. How do we live for, live with, and hear others? As Christians, our loyalty should always be to God. That is true. But as Americans, our loyalty should also be to our country. God first, country next. And yet, I challenge us to think about where our loyalties have been. I think our loyalties have been too focused inward. How do I do better? How do I live better? What does it mean for me to make more money, or for me to have prestige, or how can I succeed in this world? All of that is all about how do I, instead of how can I make my world a better place? How can I change my corner of America? How can I change my country into something that we are all proud of? Because my friends, it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, nobody can be proud of what is happening right now in our country. We may have been a country built by those who wanted change, but we need to be a country built on those who are willing to live for others and not just our own self-interests. As we move into our Matthew reading today, and we hear this idea that nobody recognized John the Baptist for who he was. And then Jesus came and nobody recognized Jesus for who he was, or not everybody recognized Jesus. And it says, I'll play you a song and you will not dance. God will give you opportunities and you will not take them. That only a few will come to know the truth and the life. But that for those who do, it will be glorious. For God shares our burdens, right? And God carries our loads. And that's such a beautiful ending to that passage. To think about and to know and to trust that God walks alongside of us. But the important part of that passage is that we do not recognize. I think about this all the time. Because we're so focused in on ourselves. Even during this pandemic, we're focused how it is affecting us and how is it affecting our children, right? We're so focused on ourselves that we are not looking beyond. Case in point, last Father's Day, we went on vacation. We went camping by ourselves just to get a little bit away from all of this pandemic, right? And after our morning worship, we left for what was going to be a hike in the woods and a bike ride. And as we were 15 minutes away from the campsite and about 30 minutes away from where we were going to take a hike, we saw a woman on the side of the road, car with the blinkers on, waving down cars. We witnessed at least 5 or 6 cars pass her by before we even got close enough to stop. we stopped. I handed my husband a mask and I told him to go see what she needed. Her tire had blown out. She had just gotten a new used car, and instead of thinking, she never looked to make sure it had everything you needed to change the tire, and she didn't have a jack with it. She couldn't change her tire. It was a hot day. She had already been flagging down people for 20 minutes before we stopped. She was grateful that somebody had stopped. My husband looked at her car and looked at her jack and said, well, we can't help you because ours isn't going to fit. But she had children in the back of her car, and they were hot, and it was a hot day. And we said, you know what? Why don't you and your children get in our car? Yes, we were worried about COVID-19. Yes, we were worried about the fact that we were still on the side of the road, but it wasn't about us in that moment. God was giving us an opportunity to help our neighbor. So we helped our neighbor. And we sat in a car for 2 hours waiting for the tow truck to come. In that 2 hours, we got to know a different person. Somebody who is very different from us and from our children, and yet we shared 2 hours in a car talking about our lives, what it was like during the worst of the pandemics, and our experiences. We listened to each other and we heard. And then the tow truck came and she went on her different way, and we went off. We did not get a hike and a bike ride in that day. We only got a bike ride in. But it didn't matter, because we had just spent 2 hours doing something that wasn't on our list of things to do on Father's Day. If we had passed this woman by, we would have given up the opportunity to live for others, but would have instead lived for ourselves. I'm sure all those people who passed her by had decent reasons. Maybe some were more fearful of COVID. Maybe some were heading to their Father's Day celebrations and didn't want to disappoint their fathers or their children, right? But we live in such a me society today that has been our focus. I can't stop because I have all these things to do. I can't stop because others I might let down. I can't stop because of how it will affect me. We fall in the trap of Romans today when we know what is right and we think that we're doing what is right, but it turns out that what we're doing is just everything for ourselves and for our own will. We fall into the trap of Romans when instead of putting our allegiance outside of ourselves and to the greater good, we put the allegiance into our success and ourselves. And we fall into the trap of this Matthew passage of not recognizing Jesus around us, not recognizing the opportunities to do God's work and God's love in the world, when again, we put our loyalty into our own, into ourselves, and to what is better for us. But my friends, we are called to do better. We are called to live a life not for ourselves. We are called to live a life that allows for disagreements and allows for conversations conversation and allows for pushback on thoughts and allows for people to love despite difference. Our passages today remind us that it is so important for us to live our lives not for ourselves, but looking outside of ourselves. Not for our own will and for our own good, but for the good, for the greater good. We are called to live a life of loyalty outside of ourselves. A life that leads to conversations with others and learning experiences of others, and a life that is called to understand that we do not have to agree to love each other. We do not have to agree to still sit in the pews and have a good friendship. We do not have to agree to be Americans. We do not have to have consensus to be Christians. But what we do have to have is love and grace. What we do have to agree on is putting our loyalty outside of our own selves and our own self-interests for the interests of God and the interests of the greater good. And until we can do that, my friends, we're going to be left in just the crisis that we are today, where nobody listens to each other, where nobody is heard, but most importantly, where God's love and grace is not felt. We are called as Christians to bring God's love and God's grace to the world. We are called to take that loyalty outside of ourselves, to put it into God and to do good in this world. We are called to change our communities, our country. We are called to share God's love. And so I encourage you this week to share God's love. To show your loyalty extends beyond yourself. And to show this country and our neighbors what it means to really want to change. To really want to be one. To really want to be an American. Amen.